The floor is yours, Dr. Naledi Pandor, for about 10 to 15 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and warm salams to all the participants and to those who join us online. All who are listening in would be aware that the apartheid state of South Africa used the death penalty as a political tool for many years against freedom fighters who were objecting to the imposition of apartheid. The Israeli apartheid state strenuously rejects being cast as an apartheid state, and yet in much of its legislation, it mirrors exactly the acts of the colonial apartheid state. And so I think by this very action that has been adopted by their parliamentarians, it provides further evidence of the degree to which apartheid Israel is a true copy of apartheid South Africa. In this month of April in South Africa, we recall a young freedom fighter called Solomon Mahlangu. Solomon Mahlangu was executed by the apartheid state 47 years ago on the 6th of April. He was a freedom fighter, a member of our armed wing of the liberation movement, Umkhonto weSizwe. And this young man illustrated very clearly that struggle for freedom can overcome any form of repression. And so it is important, as we deliberate on this new proposed legislation, that we remind the freedom-loving people of Palestine that a struggle can never be quenched, that a struggle must always continue. At the hanging line, Solomon Mahlangu, at the young age of 22, said the following words, just as the hangman approached him. He said, "Tell my people, my blood will nourish the tree that will bear the fruits of freedom. Tell my people I love them. They must continue the fight." And then he shouted, "Aluta continua," the struggle continues. And this is what we must say to everyone today. And as this committee of parliamentarians for Al-Quds and Palestine, I urge that strong collaboration be formed with all progressive parliamentarians across the world, and that the voice of parliamentarians should be heard in the International Parliamentary Union and other formations, indicating stringent objections to the action that has been taken by the Parliament of Apartheid Israel. And the question should be asked, why should this Parliament be included in democratic international institutions when its actions are patently against human rights, democracy, and human dignity? In uttering the words that he did, Solomon Mahlangu provided a signal that no repression, no matter how terrible, can crush the desire for freedom and justice. Nelson Mandela reiterated this view when he spoke at the closing of the Rivonia trial, following which he was sentenced to life in prison, knowing that his fate might be death or maybe a life sentence. He said, "I am prepared to die. I am prepared to die because what I'm fighting for is justice and freedom, something that every human being should enjoy." He was not afraid of death, but he knew that death was unjust, that death could never be a response to the desire for freedom. The apartheid state committed many crimes against humanity. All of them were directed at freedom fighters. Freedom fighters were banished, freedom fighters were detained, freedom fighters were tortured, they were sent to island prisons, they were killed in detention, and they were sentenced to hanging. But no matter how cruel and extreme their actions to end freedom, the struggle for freedom strengthened and developed ever more impactful strategies. I would urge that we have regard to the four pillars that the liberation movement in South Africa argued were essential to a struggle for freedom. The first was that there should be mass mobilization of the people, that the people must join the struggle and be on the streets. The second was that we should build bonds of international solidarity and ensure, as progressive loving men and women throughout the world in civil society, that we work together to fight injustice and build a wall of coordinated campaigns that would eventually overcome the apartheid state of Israel's practice of injustice. We did it with respect to South Africa. We must do it with respect to the people of Palestine. The third pillar was that we must have underground formations that support the struggle for freedom, and that these formations that work underground must be the ones that support mass mobilization, that provide communication on the struggle, that ensure that the struggle and its character are visible to the world and visible to the people who are suffering oppression. The fourth, of course, is that of armed struggle, of which Solomon Mahlangu, the young 22-year-old, was a part. He was a soldier of the struggle for freedom. And the liberation movements argued that these four pillars were necessary for a successful execution of a struggle for freedom. Now, what we see today is that the apartheid state of Israel has abandoned all pretense at being a civilized Western democracy. Since it has been called out for the genocide in Gaza and the current ethnic cleansing in the West Bank, the shield of impunity has been lost, and the Israeli state can only resort to increased breaches of international law. We saw this with the apartheid state. As resistance became stronger and stronger, both locally and internationally, stringent laws were strengthened further, harsher punishment, more torture, more death. We see this with respect to apartheid Israel. Nelson Mandela and his comrades showed apartheid South Africa that no repression can dim liberation. The adoption of the cynically named death bill by Israel's illegal, undemocratic legislature is an arrogant and cruel intention to desert all international law prescripts and to extend the genocide to the murder of illegally imprisoned Palestinians. The international community must work together to intensify global efforts to mount a campaign to free Palestine, a campaign directed at ending apartheid Israel impunity. This death law must be responded to with immediate call for sanctions and boycott. The global community must demand access to all political prisoners and ensure access is granted to the International Red Cross, as was done with Nelson Mandela and his fellow companions in prison on Robben Island. They were protected by international law, by international access, and we must demand the same for Palestinians illegally detained by Israel today. We should encourage an increase in global protests against this inhumane law. We should develop a common resolution for parliaments to adopt. we should ask all legal scholars on human rights, law, as well as on international law to make public statements against this proposed legislation, because we must recall that that legislation has not yet been adopted as final law. It is in the stage of consideration, and we need to stop it in its tracks now before it goes further. We must also intensify calls for the United Nations to establish a UN committee on apartheid Israel, just as we had a committee that supported the liberation movements in South Africa against the apartheid state's actions. The role of the United Nations is imperative to addressing the breaches of international law committed by Israel. As I said earlier, at the conclusion of the Rivonia trial, Nelson Mandela spoke of his readiness to give up his life for his people. While serving as president of a free South Africa, he spoke of the cruel futility of the death penalty. Mandela would be horrified and disgusted at legislators who sip champagne as they adopt one of the cruelest forms of torture. Israel is a state that very closely reflects apartheid South Africa. It has no respect for human rights, for justice and freedom, and should not be treated as a respectable state. The only adequate response to this death law is intensified global action for justice. As Solomon Mahlangu said at his death, "Aluta continua." The struggle must continue. I thank you.